So, welcome to Groundswell. First time I've ever spoken in a big top. So we'll try and keep the clown noises to the minimum. What I'm going to do today is introduce you to the underworld, all sorts of aspects around that. The organisers gave me the title of What Lies Beneath, and the subtitle is mine. So I want to take you underground. And the underworld, well, it's had a lot of bad press over the years. In the Divine Comedy, 14th century, Dante's Inferno, the first start there, not a very good strapline, especially for Groundswell. I presume they kicked that one out of the ideas very quickly. But essentially, the view was that the underworld was a dark and nasty place, and picked up all sorts of connotations, etc. So Dante and his pal Virgil, who went down there, had a hell of a time. And if you look at the engravings from Doré from the 1850s there, they're pretty serious stuff. So what I want to do is try and cast some light down there, and we can see that it's not quite so bad. So let's have some views of the underworld from the 21st century rather than the 14th and the 19th. So the outline of what I'm going to talk about for the next 50 minutes or so will need to set some context. I'm going to talk very briefly about what soils are, introduce you to soils, and then look at what's alive below ground. So talk about the soil biology, and the reasons for why we're focusing on that so much will become apparent. Also, a lot of consideration of soil structure, for again, reasons that will become apparent. Visualization, yes, it's views of what's going on down there, and I've spent a lot of my research career visualizing soil systems, and especially the life down there. So lots of visualization, and lots of concepts for you. So, I'm an academic. I've been studying soils for 40 years, understanding how they work, etc., etc. So I'm going to give you lots and lots of concepts, perhaps too many for first thing on the morning like this. So there's a PDF of the talk available as well. If you drop me an email, I'm happy to send you a copy so you can pick up the words there as well and have some pictures to look at. The reason, of course, we want to do this is it takes us by, my belief is that understanding how systems work, then that will lead to more effective management of those systems, and in the context of Groundswell, etc., it's about sustainable soil management. So, that's a better strapline, isn't it, than abandoning hope. So let's just pick up with what is soil? Well, it's the foundation of all natural terrestrial environments and all managed environments where we're talking about soil-based productivity, whether that's in Scotland or olive grove in Spain there, or rainforest in Malaysia. Soil underpins those terrestrial environments. It's also the foundation of civilization. Now, everybody, that looks like a bit of a cliche. In one sense it is, because it's often said, but actually it's pretty serious. Soil is fundamental to civilization. The Native American Indians we see on your right there, they were well aware of that because they were living on it. They were sleeping on that surface, and they also understood how important soil was for providing the food that sustained them. In medieval times, still agrarian societies largely, cities were developing, but I'm sure that many people there were aware of the importance of soil for their sustenance. In contemporary Milton Keynes, chosen carefully, concrete cows and all that, I'm not so sure. Many urban people, larger proportion of the global population is now urban. There's a disconnect between soils and survival in that sort of sense. So soils are absolutely fundamental to our past, current, and future civilizations. So as regenerative agriculture folk, you're kind of custodians for the future there. So no pressure. We need to look after this. From other perspectives, well, from your perspective, soil is above all else a resource. It's the second most important business asset you have in your enterprise. The first most important is your brain, because that's what makes the decisions in terms of how you're going to manage your enterprise and the soil system. But after that, I would argue that soil is your number one resource, because without that, you aren't going to be growing stuff. From a more scientific perspective, which is where I want to take us today a little bit, I would consider soil, above all else, to be a structured, porous medium. We'll talk about that again in a minute. It's an adaptive, dynamic system. Soil is not just stuff that sits there, okay? It can change in time. and so on. That's of huge consequence. And it's also a habitat. What habitat means is it's where things live. And again, we're going to talk about that throughout the talk. Click. The other thing to remember is that soil is not just soil, it's soils. Soils are enormously variable depending on where you are on the globe. So here's some soil maps of Europe and then of England and Wales. Different colours represent different soil types with different characteristics. Look how varied England and Wales or the UK actually is in these terms. So huge variation in soils there. So we talk glibly about soil, but what we actually mean is soils, and you'll have a particular sort of soil in your local environment. What's common across all these soils, it doesn't matter where they are, is that they're made up of 6 basic constituents. Mineral material, which is the solid hard stuff, and that will be underwritten by the geology of the site. Organic matter, which is the solid soft stuff, part of which is alive, and that's the organisms. Then also there are gases in the soil there, there's water, and there are things dissolved in those phases, solutes and colloids. So wherever you are on the planet, soil will be made up of these different constituents, but just different characteristics and different proportions that will lead to different properties and characters, etc., etc. So what does it look like? Well, here's the first of the visualization series. On your right is the familiar view of the field, a potato field in Perthshire, next to a nice bit of parkland. Then in the middle, a soil surface. We're zooming in there. Again, so far, so familiar. It's brown, a bit patchy. There's some straw there, etc., etc. But if we zoom in by another factor of 10 using a microscope, then the perspective changes hugely, because now we start to see some of these constituents in more detail. And here are some plant roots with some root hairs and fungal hyphae, more of those in a minute. But also you can see that there are particles there are gaps, there is the solid stuff, but there are also pores. It's shiny, there's water there. From the surface of that field, you can't see the water. Down the microscope, you can see water films. So this is, you'll appreciate what I'm taking you here is things change as you increase the magnification and start to look in depth. Now, part of the problem with soils is if you lift them up and bash them around, they fall apart. So it's very difficult to see what's happening at much smaller scales. So using special techniques of impregnating soils with liquid resins that then set hard, it's possible to cut a block of soil and look inside there at higher magnifications. So we're zooming in by another factor of 10 now, and you can see the perspective is really starting to change. Now you can see the mineral grains, that's the light material, the dark stuff there's a lump of charcoal, and then the crinkly light grey stuff. These are soil pores that are now full of resin. So you can start to see that porous nature. But look how heterogeneous that material is at these sorts of 0.5 millimeter scales. Now, I mentioned that the part of the organic matter is alive, the organisms. This is something I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes and introduce you to life below ground in some more detail. So, of the organisms of life below ground, in a handful of arable soil, say that potato field that we saw earlier, there's about 200 grams of soil there. And in there, there'll be about 0.5 gram of living material, what we call biomass, fresh biomass there. But you can't see any of that in the handful. And the reason is that the vast majority of life below ground is microbial. What microbial means is too small to see with the naked eye. So I've done a back of an envelope calculation. If you could make all this life in the soil come out in a big wobbly heap, what would it look like? And the clue is wobbly heap, because astonishingly, it's about 5 tons per hectare, or the equivalent of about 100 sheep, depending how well you fed your sheep. So, and in grassland, there'll be 10 times that. So the equivalent of about 1,000 sheep per hectare below ground, actually out on the pasture there, where the groundswell is happening. There'll be this amount of living material. Now, it's not all bleating at the same time. A lot of it's very snoozy, but there's that much. So the amount of the biomass below ground always equals and sometimes can exceed the amount of biomass above ground. So a lot of life down there. How can that be? How can it all fit? Well, the answer is it's very, very small. So the soil biomass is sort of just a way of thinking of the whole stuff as one big black box, one lump, but there's a very high degree of biodiversity in there as well. In fact, nearly all life forms are represented below ground. Microbes, the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, the nematodes, things with legs, etc., etc. We'll look at some pictures of those in a minute. But there's also a big size range. And of course, if there's so much life, then there has to be an awful lot that is very, very small. But the size range goes from micrometers, a micrometer is 1,000th of a millimeter, all the way up to centimeters, talking about moles or rabbits or badgers or whatever else. These mass calculations do not involve plant roots. This is just what we call the soil biota, which excludes the plant root part of that, okay? So the other astonishing thing is, of course, if there's such a large biomass and they're so tiny, there must be an awful lot of them. So in that handful, there'll be about 100 trillion bacteria, 50 kilometers of fungal hyphae, and thousands of these other organisms. But of course, the larger they get, the fewer of them there are. So, you know, 100th of a badger in the handful, you get the feel there. But essentially, you know, and then if you start putting the plants into this story as well, you've got many meters of plant roots down there as well, sometimes kilometers in grassland places. But look at the diversity. Above ground, typically you rarely have more than 10 species of plant above ground. Perhaps 100 in the ultimate species-rich meadow. But below ground, there are tens of thousands of species. The microbial scale, there is a huge genetic diversity. There are reasons for that, and there are consequences arising from it. Again, we haven't got time to go into all those details today, but I'm happy to chat about that later if you like. So what does all this soil biota get up to? Well, the analogy I like to use is describe this soil biota, this soil biomass, as the biological engine of the earth, because soils function. That's your other key concept, all right? Soils do things. They do all sorts of things, and most of the things they do are underwritten to a greater and sometimes lesser extent by this biology. The sorts of things that the functions that soil deliver, again, we have a theoretical framework we call ecosystem goods and services. You may have come across this. It was part of the Millennium Assessment. But essentially, it's a way of thinking about ecological systems in terms of what do they do, and there's a bit of a human-centric perspective from it and what they do for us. But let's turn it around and just say, what do they do for the planet in this sort of sense? And here's the whole range of the panoply of functions that soils are carrying out. Your principal focus initially, of course, will be in terms of food supply, raw materials, and biomaterials. But there's a lot more besides that in terms of soils are storing water, they're purifying it, they provide a platform to live on, American Indians and a tent versus these tents in your house, etc. They're involved with primary production, of course, gas regulation, climate change, all that sort of stuff, and cognitive functions. Nice landscapes underwritten by appropriate soil. So a huge range of functions and processes go on there, and as I say, the vast majority are governed by that soil biota. We're going to talk a bit more about that later in the presentation. But first of all, I want to just take you through a whistle-stop tour through biodiversity and the sorts of organisms that we find below ground. These are the larger guys. We'll start big and go small. These are more or less familiar to you because you will have seen them around. So things like spiders, worms, snails, etc., etc. So this is, we call this the macrofauna, the larger stuff. Here's some photos by a guy called Andy Murray, who is the master of a technique called stacked focus photography, which means you can photograph very small things but actually get a much bigger depth of focus. So he has some astonishing pictures of, in this case, mites. These are arachnids. They've got 8 legs. Massive diversity. Thousands and thousands of different species of mites, and in grassland you'll find several hundred there. And they eat all sorts of things from each other to fungi and decaying organic matter and so forth. Collembola, the so-called springtails. These are, again, tiny wee creatures that used to be classified as insects. They're not. They're called hexapods because, unlike insects, their mouth parts are internal and not external. So, and again, massive diversity. They're called springtails because they have a little device that they can flick from underneath their abdomen that lets them jump. And again, if you YouTube this, there's some amazing videos showing that the argument is that springtails are amongst the fastest moving organisms on the planet because the velocity of escape that they invoke using this device is really quite astonishing. But again, hugely diverse and varied. Then if we move down to things that you don't see with your naked eye particularly, then we come to things like nematode worms. And again, these are ubiquitous. They actually, they're everywhere on the planet, but most especially in soils. They are tiny worms, multicellular, and they, again, eat all sorts. Basically, whatever you are, there's a nematode that will eat you. And they are adapted to do that by different sorts of mouth parts. So it's a bit like your electric drill device. You just change the mouth parts at the front. The back bit is much the same. The mouth parts are adapted to eating fungi or siphoning up bacteria or eating other nematodes by crashing into the side of the body of the prey and splitting it open with three sort of teeth-like protuberances. That's the one at the bottom there. Those three little marks there are actually like equivalent to teeth. Then there is we move from the multicellular organisms to the single cellular, and there's a whole range of protozoa, all sorts of these. The one I like to introduce to you is essentially pond life. You might have come across that at school biology. So an amoeba is just a naked blob of cytoplasm that moves by a process of oozing through water films. So the gel moves forward at the front and retracts at the back. And these, again, tens of thousands in the soil, in the gram of soil, they move through the soil pores in water films. And they eat bacteria and fungal spores and organic debris, just again by engulfing them and digesting them. And fungi, you'll be familiar with from moldy bread. All the threads on your moldy bread are what we call hyphae of the fungus. This forms a branched network called a mycelium, very well adapted to growing in spatially structured environments like bread or soil. And so here are some fungal hyphae growing through the soil pores. The blue shiny bits are the fungal threads. And you can see, again, they tend to be sticking to those pores rather than going through the soil particles there. And then finally to the smallest organisms, and these are bacteria. These are, again, just single-celled organisms, tiny, about 1 micrometer in diameter, and there are various basic shapes. There are spherical ones or rod-shaped ones, and some of them are curly. They are colonial, so they stick to the surface of the soil and carry out all sorts of processes, again, that we'll talk about later. So here's an example of a tiny fungal colony embedded in a soil matrix. And I like to show this because what you can see is that if we think about the nematode that's moving through soil pores, or the amoeba is moving through soil pores, bacteria aren't really adapted to moving. They stick onto surfaces and they form colonies and they proliferate and grow. But they can only do that if they've got the food to do so. So here's a colony of bacteria embedded in soil. And those bacteria aren't going to go anywhere fast. They're stuck there. So they have to rely on supply of nutrients, etc., through the small pores that are around them to deliver that. Some bacteria are motile and they can swim. They have little flagellae, but the vast majority in soils are static and they stick to the surfaces. Here's a curious thing. Despite there being 100 trillion bacteria in a handful of soil, when you get down to these tiny microscopic scales, you'll notice there are still quite large volumes of soil there that don't have any life in them. So actually, it's quite a desert at these tiny scales. That'll be disconcerting, and it's just because you're not familiar to these microscopic scales. So a whistle-stop tour of the variety of life below ground. We'll just scrape the surface there. I could talk about that for hours in one sense, but I'm not going to do that. I want to get on to some aspects of how soils are functioning, and I need to describe to you how then this biological engine actually works. We'll stick to the engine analogy because the way it works is, at the simplest level, is that solar energy arrives on the Earth's surface from the sun. That's energy. Plants capture that energy by the process that you'll know as photosynthesis, and they turn it into sugar, glucose in the first instance. So the energy that was once light is now chemical energy. And that plant material is therefore a potential food source for actually all other life forms on the planet, including ourselves. But in the soil ecosystem, what's happening is that plant material at some point becomes what we call soil organic matter, i.e. it's dead. It's no longer alive. So organic matter is the dead material there. That organic matter contains energy. So these organisms, and the microbes in the first instance, will essentially eat and extract the energy from that organic matter and use it to grow and reproduce and pass on their genes, etc., which is what life is driven to do. And then the protozoa and the nematodes will come along and eat those bacteria for the same reason, to get energy from those bacteria. And then the larger organisms will come along and eat those protozoa and nematodes. The mites will come and munch on those. Again, same thing, they're feeding to get the energy, and then the larger stuff will come along and eat those. Meanwhile, plant material is being harvested for humans to eat. Now, this is the basics, this is what we call trophic levels. So as the energy moves from sort of one compartment to another, then energy is being transferred. The concept at this level is fairly straightforward, but actually in reality it's much more complicated than that, because essentially it doesn't just go that one way, it goes in all directions. So all the different organisms can kind of eat each other and interact in all sorts of different ways, in myriad of ways. And this sets up what we call a food web, because it's a big interconnected system. But the key thing is that energy is moving from compartment to compartment. And when energy is transferred, work is done. And the work that is done is all these functions that we talked about in that earlier slide. Okay, so this is what's driving that biological engine. So you can start to think about soil organic matter as the fuel of this soil engine. And over the years, I've used this slide quite a lot, and I've got a petrol pump there, and because fuel is something that we can relate to. But of course, that's kind of wrong, because that's fossil fuel, boo hiss. And really, what is driving this is green fuel. The soil biological engine is driven exclusively by the big green plants in the system there. That has, that's profound implications of that in terms of how we're going to manage and develop sustainable systems. So organic matter, soil scientists are always banging on about it, why it's important. I've just started to introduce to one of the key reasons why that is. There are many and varied forms available to use in kind of managing the soil system. So lovely green manure there. That's full of energy. That will be going into the soil and helping to drive the system. Residues from your crop, a very important source. Animal manures, etc., key role. Composts and things that can actually be imported into the system. Many and varied forms of organic matter there to use and try and manage. So another analogy, you can use this with your accountant, is you can start to think about carbon or organic matter as a sort of currency of your soil economy. And of course, what you want for a nice, healthy economy is some decent input, some decent turnover, and a sensible amount of output. So you don't want to have outputs. You don't want to be ripping out from the bank account all the time so that eventually you go too overdrawn. And it's the same sort of principle is applying in the soil system. You're managing energy at the end of the day here, which is carbon, which is organic matter there. So now I'm going to move on to another key aspect of the soil system and talk a bit more about soil structure. And the reason I need to do this is that it's absolutely fundamental to how soils function. Soil structure is really about the pore networks that you find in soils. This is the inner space, in and through which all soil processes are occurring. It's fundamental because it sets the nature of the habitat. This is where all the biota I've been talking about live and reside and do their stuff. It's also, that leads on to, as a rooting medium, plants are also growing through the soil, so they need a nice porous network to grow through and get their roots down there to acquire the water and the nutrients. There's a really important interaction between soil structure and water, we'll touch on in a second, but also aspects relating to compaction and erosion, in the sense of a compacted soil will have a reduced pore network or a changed pore network, and the extent to which that soil is held together will interact with the propensity to erosion. So again, what you're looking for is this trade-off between soils that are going to hold together nicely and keep that structure. If they don't do that, they'll fall apart and wash away with all the consequences of erosion. Now these are, remember I showed you that resin-impregnated block of soil. This is where we can go one step further and take a thin slice of that soil and shine light through it, so we can start to visualize the pore network. So these are two-dimensional slices through a soil system, and some examples of the variety that you see in that sort of soil structure, again, depending on the inherent nature of the soil and how it's being managed. The scale bar on the top there, the black bar there, doesn't have a number on it. And there's a very curious and fascinating reason and consequence for that. And that is, that bar could represent 1 centimeter, 1 millimeter, 1 micrometer. And yet the soil would still look like this. So unique amongst materials, I think certainly on the planet, possibly in the universe, soils have structure across many orders of spatial scale. Doesn't matter how much you zoom in, there is still structure there. There are still pores there. There is still space for things to happen. And again, there are reasons for that and lots of consequences. One of the key consequences is that it affects how soils hold and release water. So this is the second most important graph in your enterprise. The first most important is that showing your bank balance and your bank budget. The second one is in relation to how your soils are holding and dealing with water. We call this the moisture release characteristic. Don't worry about the fancy terms, but essentially what it's about is that all those different sized pores in the soil will hold the water to a greater or lesser extent depending how small they are. The big pores hold water very loosely and they will drain quite quickly under gravity. The small pores will hold water rather more tightly, and you have to suck that water a bit harder to get it out. And that's what the graph is showing. The matrix potential at the bottom is essentially how much suck you put on the soil, and the y-axis is how much water is there. So the more you suck, the less water will be there. But the point is that the very tiny pores, so if you look at the top cartoon there, a saturated soil is full of water, all the pores are there. As that soil drains, the larger pores drain and have air in them, and the smaller pores hold water. As the soil drains more and more, the tiny pores still hold a little bit of water in there, but you have to suck so hard that plant roots can't get it, but fungal hyphae can. And eventually there'll be water in pores that are so small, even fungal hyphae can't get it. So the point is that what you want is a soil structure such that it will have a wide range of pore sizes, so it will hold water and provide water across this whole range of different suctions. The other critical thing is that in that intermediate panel there, you can see that we have a combination of air and water. And that's exactly what life needs in order to function, because essentially it's aerobic respiration. The organisms are breathing air, breathing oxygen to carry out all their processes. So you have just what life needs, which is a combination of water and air at the same time. So some air and water in combination is the optimum position to allow the biological engine to be functioning most effectively. Now, I've shown you some two-dimensional slices through a three-dimensional world, which was in the old days. New technology marches on, and we are able to use X-ray computed tomography to look at soil structure in 3 dimensions. You'll be familiar with X-ray CT from a medical context. It's used in material science a lot, and now we can also use it for looking at soil systems. So I'm going to show you an X-ray tomograph of a soil core. This is a repacked one that we use for experimental circumstances. It's a negative image, so white is very solid and black is the pore space. And if the double-click works, thank you, support. Great. So spinny rotatey of a 3D structure here. The blue stuff is water, and you can see how heterogeneous and complex that structure is as we move through slice after slice through that. These are kind of 2D slices, but because this is tomography, we can also use, this is like a digital image in 3D, we can use that to start to create a 3-dimensional volume and visualize that and then zoom through it as if we were a worm moving through these soil pores. Notice that some pores have got air in and some have got water, and then here's the sort of worm's eye view. So in 3D, what you're talking about is a vast, complex, 3-dimensional, multi-scale labyrinth. And you can start to imagine how this is then going to start to constrain how organisms can get through there. We're coming out the other side in a Star Wars moment there. So what's very special about this technique is not only does it allow us to do these things in 3D, but it's non-destructive. So we can look at soil structure in space and time. Very powerful research tool that and certainly changes perspectives on the system there. So some examples of some tomographs of a no-till versus a ploughed soil. You can see a massive difference in the pore networks there. There's lots of lovely connected, large and different sized pores in the no-till system, whereas the ploughed system is just this smashed up, exploding rice pudding. The other thing we can do with tomography is we can visualize plant roots. The microbes are much more of a challenge. They're a bit too small, but plant roots are now certainly in purview. And on the top there, you have a maize root growing through soil. And in the bottom, again, very exciting. It's possible to actually sort out which root belongs to which plant. So there's an example of 3 wheat plants growing in a soil. Different color is a different wheat plant. So again, for the first time now, we're able to look at below-ground interactions between plant species, providing all sorts of very exciting opportunities to understand what's going on down there. So the other CT thing I want to show you is, get this to run, is just a quick focus on the soil surface, talking an awful lot about the soil volume, but the soil surface is also a very important part of the system because it is the bit that connects the atmosphere to the soil system. It's the bit that allows water to get into the soil and provide, that resource, and where the gas exchange is occurring. So you might not have thought about that in those sorts of terms. There's a rainfall demonstration thing going on after this. So recommend you go and have a look at that and start to think about the soil surface in those sorts of terms. What the tomography allows us to do, though, is visualize this system, and also we can do things like look at the extent to which pores that are open on the surface are connected to the rest of the soil system or not, and all these pore sizes, because again, you can imagine that the connectivity of that surface is very critical. And again, that's something that we need to think about and how we might manage that. So lots to talk about there in terms of the rainfall simulator as well. I intend to be over at that one, so we can pick up questions there if you like. So, lots of exciting ways and cool new ways to look at soil systems and visualize them. I want to just give you one particular example now about how the soil biological engine is working in terms of delivering those functions. So, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about soil structure and the role of soil biota in that. The pest and disease and nutrient cycling are for another talk I'm giving this afternoon, where we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of these mechanisms if you're interested in that. So that's an advert for where this goes. But we've already rehearsed why soil structure is so important. What I want to do is explain to you how the soil biological engine creates and destroys soil structure. And it does this via a range of both direct and indirect effects. And the way to remember the mechanisms is it's rather like a typical morning at a kindergarten or nursery, because there's a whole load of click. Tech support, my clicker's stuck. Thank you. That's caught me out of my joke, hasn't it? So let's go back. Typical morning at a nursery or kindergarten or whatever else, there's a whole load of moving, gluing, sewing, painting, or eating going on. The gluing part is many of these organisms that we're talking about are sticky, especially the bacteria, because they're sticking to soil surfaces. So they are gluing those soil particles together. The sewing part is the long, stringy things that are growing in the soil are essentially stitching those soil particles together. And those are the fungal hyphae at one scale and plant roots at another scale. The painting part of it is many organisms are producing materials to coat themselves, essentially to stop themselves drying out. It's a tough call down there when the soil dries. So these are like insulating coats to protect the organisms from desiccation. This also sloughs off and paints the soil surfaces, and that serves to stabilize them. And the moving part is where some of the larger organisms especially can actually move the soil around. And the iconic organisms that do this, of course, are the earthworms. And we often describe earthworms as the ecosystem engineers because they are actually engineering at a scale that's familiar to humans. There are different sorts of earthworms, but they all ingest soil and extrude it from their back ends. And it's about 28 species of earthworm in the UK. There are hundreds of species on the continent. The Ice Age zapped ours. But amongst the different species, there are 3 different types of worm, all right? And we call those ecological groups. Don't worry about the posh names. It's what they do that's important in this aspect. So there are those that live predominantly on the soil surface, and they chew up the organic matter and pass it out. They just move around on that surface. There are then those that take that organic matter and pull it down into their persistent vertical burrows. These are the vertical burrows forms. And they make little, they have chambers deep down in the soil where they reside and don't dry out. But they pull material into the soil. And then there's a third group that live in the soil matrix itself and don't come out. They just move around within the body of the soil. So essentially what's happening is you've got three functions here that are needed to get that organic matter into the soil system. This is nature's way of getting that energy below ground from above ground residues. Things along the top that chew it up, things that pull it, types that pull it in, and types that mix it up. So here's a consequence of biodiversity for you, because you can see that if you have these three, if a biodiverse system is more likely to have these three complementary functions in place, and therefore it's intact and functional. But if there's no epigeics around, then there's no mixing going on, and therefore it's much harder for the other guys who've adapted to be pulling in mixed stuff down there. So you need to break that cycle. So there's a consequence of biodiversity for you. A large amount of material can go through worms, especially the earthworms. There are other worm types that ingest smaller amounts of soil. In an arable field, there'll be about 3/4 of a ton of soil is processed per annum. This is quite old data. A pasture, 10 times that, so we're back to the 10 times different story. And a humid savanna or a tropical system where there's loads more vegetation, loads more energy, 10 times that again. Okay, so orders of magnitude depending on the circumstance. Some of these vertical burrowing worms, we've shown with some controlled studies that they can move up to 30 times their body weight of soil in one day if they have sufficient energy to do that. They've got to have enough food to do that. If they're hungry, of course, they'll slow down. So the earthworm cast, that which comes out the back, the soil that comes out the back of the worm, is structurally very changed. It's been mixed, it's been comminuted, it's been inoculated with other organisms, and it's been compressed and extruded. And here's an earthworm cast on a golf green. And of course, well, this isn't really soil, this is pure sand. So pure sand that comes out the back end of the worm has sufficient structural strength to divert the play of a golf ball to such an extent that earthworms, the iconic creature of soil health, from a green manager's perspective, is actually seen as a pest. Personally, I think a few earthworm casts on your green would make the game of golf just that little bit more interesting. So what's the impact of all this, the change in structure and what the worms are doing and so forth? Well, very nice piece of work done a few years ago now where it's possible, if you have enough data, to do a statistical technique called meta-analysis, which allows you to actually calculate the contribution of a particular factor to a process or an outcome. So on the basis of 130 studies, this group in the Netherlands were able to calculate and show statistically that on average, on balance, all things being equal, the presence of earthworms actually in a vegetated system, but especially in a cropping system, will result in an increase in yield, or 25% contribution to that increase in yield. So all other things being equal, worms are really significantly affecting that yield. The mechanisms for that are many and varied, especially around soil structure, and there's an interaction with nitrogen here as well. But overall, then earthworms are really significantly contributing to that actual yield. So that leads to the question, and you can answer this with these sorts of analyses, well, just how many earthworms should I have in my field? And because we have the data, we can answer that. If you take a sort of biscuit tin-sized lump of soil from your field, so that's a sort of spade by a spade by a spade, 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters. If you have, click, 16 worms in that, you are pretty much on the apex of that response curve. So 16 worms is really good news. You are going to be getting a 20% order of contribution to your yield from the presence of those worms. If you've got 32 worms, you aren't going to have a 50% increase in yield. That's not how nature works. It always plateaus out. If you've got 4 worms, you're in trouble in the sense that you're just not realizing the potential of that system. And 8 worms will start to be going up there. So at last, we actually have an indicator of soil health from an agricultural production perspective. We have a biological indicator that you can actually translate directly and use as an indicator. And that's simply the number of worms. You don't really have to worry about what types there are. So long as you've got 16 wrigglers, I think you're doing well. And if you haven't got that, then you need to try and manage your system up to that. And again, there are ways to do that we can talk about later if you like. So let's just move quickly on to the eating part of that story. Remember, moving, gluing, sewing, painting. Eating is where the biota are also involved in destroying soil structure. And the mechanism behind this is where the majority of the materials or the agents that are gluing this soil together and then stabilizing it is organic material. It contains energy, and therefore it represents a food source. The organisms can't always get to that food because of soil structure itself. That if the organic matter is hidden away in a tiny soil pore, then the organisms can't get at it, and so it prevails and it carries on sticking together. So conceptually, if you imagine here's a bit of grey bit of soil, and the orange stuff in the middle is some nice organic matter containing lots of energy, the organisms can't get in there because the pores are too small. So they're sitting on the outside, and actually they're hungry because they've eaten everything they can get hold of. They're then spatially constrained. But if that aggregate is disrupted and, say, cracks open, then a new pathway to find that is made available, and the organism will soon get in there because they'll detect it's there, and they'll start to decompose it. And when they decompose it, then that material is no longer holding the soil together anymore in any sense. So one little experiment to tell you about that shows the effect of this is that the effects of soil disturbance on the rate at which this biological engine works. This is an experiment done 20-odd years ago by some folk at Rothamsted, where they tilled a soil in 3 different ways. So the control was no tillage. They had a low-energy tillage with a dyna drive, whatever one of those is, a high-energy tillage that was 4 passes with a big spiky rotor, so it really mixed up the soil. And being physicists, they calculated there was a 6-fold difference in energy input in stirring this up. I'm going to show you a graph with real data now, so don't be worried about that. One thing that COVID has done is it means it's got people used to graphs. So next slide, please. Oops, let's get back on. Here's the graph of the results from that study. The control line is at the bottom there, the circle. So this is the rate at which the soil is respiring. This is the rate at which carbon dioxide is coming out of the soil. If you like, it's the rate at which the soil is respiring or breathing. Okay, so obviously if it's working very hard, a lot more CO2 will be coming out. So the control is along the bottom there. The dotted line is the squares is the low energy tillage. So there's been an increase in respiration rate that then declines and goes back to the control. But the high energy tillage, where it was super stirred, that engine is flaring up and going really, really fast, because you can see there's a 4-fold increase, so 4 or 5-fold increase in respiration rate that goes on for 6 or 7 or 8 days and then gradually slows down again as all the food that's been made available is eaten, and then the whole system calms down again. But that's carbon dioxide, that's CO2 leaving the soil. That's carbon leaving the building. That carbon is no longer down there contributing to the functioning of that biological engine. So what this tells us is about the pivotal role of soil disturbance in reducing soil organic matter concentrations. And the mechanism behind that is what we call a priming effect as a result of reducing the physical protection of that organic matter. So the disturbance primes the decomposition of organic matter, the burn off of that carbon, that goes off as CO2, and that's left the building. So if you carry this on for ages and ages and keep stirring the soil up, in due course, you will be reducing the energy available in that system, especially if residues are being removed because straw is being baled and taken away, especially if you're just mincing it up all the time. But as well as changing all those physical protection mechanisms, what it's also doing is stirring up all that habitat. It's sending the organisms crazy. All those fungal hyphae are being torn apart. It's killing the worms. Those vertical worm channels that have been formed have now been disrupted. The worms have to rebuild those. They haven't got any energy to do that because the residues aren't there. So, and over the last decades of an obsession with tillage, okay, for some reasons, but we can come back to that, over the years, this is one of the drivers behind the loss in organic matter from soil systems that we've been seeing. And again, it's back to how we're going to get those back in. So at this point, I think we're going a bit monochrome, and I think that slide and this data is sort of telling us, actually, this is the grim view of the underworld perspective, because what it's showing us is that if you smash the system up and don't feed it, etc., then for sure it's going to get pretty ugly down there, Whereas, say, Dante and Virgil if they were coming into the 21st century, I'm sure they'd have a lot more to talk about, a lot more positive things to say about the views of the underworld if we look at it from these perspectives of new ways of seeing that system. So I want to start to pull this together now with some more concepts for you, and just concepts that will, I think, stitch the whole thing. If you get these in your head and start thinking about them, a lot of what I've said before will go into place more and make sense for future ways of thinking about soil systems. And that is, first and foremost, that soil is a living system. Okay? Soil is alive. It's founded on an appropriate spatial configuration. I've given you some examples of why that's so important and how that works. And it's all about appropriate community structures living within that inner space that lead to an effective functioning of the system. So the key concept here is one of soil architecture, because what architecture means, it's about the interaction of living organisms with the spatial organization of their environment. And again, you know, that's what architects do. A good house or a good building or a good town will function as a result of an appropriate spatial organization of the system to allow life, humans in this case largely, to live in there, to interact, to communicate, to get their deliveries and all these sorts of things going. If that's all smashed up and not right, so it's like, you know, like ruined, then of course it ain't going to work very well. So soil architecture is the concept that sort of stitches the whole thing together there. And the other one is that, and we've already rehearsed this, is that organic matter is the fuel for the biological engine. So key, number one reason it's key is for that reason. So what can you do? Okay, lots of theory and concepts and things there. What would be my 4 suggestions for, again, headlines for how one would manage soil biology? What can you do about this in very general terms? Specific cases, of course, are always different, and it ain't easy because you have this extraordinarily complex system. So first and foremost, I would say, keep the habitat healthy, and you'll have an intuitive feel for what that is. I've given you some examples of some nuances that are involved there. So keep your soil habitat healthy. How you do that is you avoid messing up the architecture, okay? So manage soil structure appropriately. Secondly is keep feeding the system. Keep fueling that biological engine. You have many options for those sources of energy, principally residues, but I would argue first and foremost plants, because plants are mainlining that solar energy into the soil system. The principles of sustainability are very simple, but rather hard to realize at the end of the day. If you have a system, whether it's your body, your field, your farm, whatever, if you take out more than you put in, your bank account, it ain't going to be sustainable. So pay attention and replace what you remove. Not necessarily in exactly the same year, but you know, you've got time to play with here, but over time, make sure that you're putting back into the system what you've removed, whether that's carbon or molybdenum or whatever else. And the other one is, and again, we haven't had time to go through the mechanistic reasons for this, but my other important message is encourage and maintain diversity in the system. Diversity in space and time, so crop rotations and these sorts of things. Many of you will be doing this in basic enterprise terms as well, but diverse systems are inherently more resilient. And again, there are reasons for that if you want to, we can talk about later. So don't mess it up, keep feeding it, put things back in, and keep it diverse. So welcome to the universe that's preoccupied me throughout my career. Here are soil systems across 11 orders of spatial magnitude, and indeed, your universe as well. You are all using soils, from the planet to Europe to the north of England to a landscape, this potato field, and then all the various zooming in using Carl's crazy microscopes, etc., etc. So I think you'll now agree that Dante and Virgil notwithstanding, there's a lot more to soils, and therefore the underworld, it's a world because it's alive, than at first meets the eye. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
We've got time for a few questions.
Can
can I just ask, what's the effect of glyphosate on the soil life?
So glyphosate is a xenobiotic with a specific function of killing plants off. So it's designed to be toxic, particularly to plants. And of course, with any such toxin, there are inevitably impacts on other organisms. So but in general, the more specific the target for the organism, then these side effects diminish. So glyphosate is targeted towards plants, so it certainly screws plants and anything green, so algae and all the photosynthetic bacteria and so on and so forth. Other organisms in general are less prone to being affected by it, and the data is that if you put worms in a can and force feed them 3 kilos of glyphosate, they don't like it. They will die. There will be impacts on a subset of the soil biota and to a lesser extent a subset of the microbiota, because one of the consequences of that huge diversity is that even xenobiotics, a lot of them are resistant to that, etc., etc. So basically, of course, there are side effects, but it is not a broad spectrum biocide, so it does not kill off the vast majority of what's down there, and indeed, it doesn't actually compromise that. There's a proportion of the soil biota that can actually eat it, so there is a natural degradation, and again, apart from a few really pernicious ones, again, most xenobiotics can be degraded in time, so yes, some will prevail. My take on this and my answer to these sorts of questions generally is that, okay, sometimes you have to use these sorts of interventions to kind of save or manage the system. I will take antibiotics if I'm seriously ill, but I'll avoid it on the whole. The point is that if you have a very a healthy system, or you have a very diverse, biodiverse system that's intact and functioning along the lines that we're talking about here, then that system is more resilient inherently, and therefore it will be more resilient to the point use, or when on occasion you need to use these things, be more resilient to dealing with that circumstance. So the impact of glyphosate in a super managed, well-green manured, no-till system with a massive functioning biological engine will be much smaller than if you're spraying glyphosate onto a clapped-out potato field in Perthshire, or other counties are available. So we have to be pragmatic here, but you don't want to lose too much sleep over the sense of if you're thinking about this in a wider system context and have a diverse system, you will have more resilience to these sorts of things. So there are plenty of growers out there who are using glyphosate, but they've got millions of worms in their soils.
Professor, coming as we both do from Cornwall, could you please describe a little more the role of grassland in taking carbon out of the atmosphere and into the soil, as we now think we may be measured on the amount of carbon we have in our soil going forward? Thank you.
Okay, well, lovely, scary policy question for a scientist there. Thank you. So, as all systems, so the extent to which carbon is sequestered by that system, it goes back to my inputs and outputs thing, okay? If more carbon is coming out than is going in, carbon will not be sequestered. By definition, it's being lost. Different vegetation systems can contribute to that in different ways, and so a highly tilled arable system will tend not to do that because, for reasons you've seen in those graphs, it's being stirred up and so it's losing carbon. Grasslands sort of sit in between, in that you have a permanent vegetation that is always fixing carbon and bringing it in there. So the key to carbon sequestration in the grassland is an appropriate management, where you're taking care to ensure that the amount of carbon that leaves the soil is rather less than the amount of carbon that's going into the soil. Now, the ways to do that, and the management terms for that, again, are many and varied. It kind of depends how much carbon you're cropping from that, how much grass you're taking off, how many sheep you're taking off, because every kilo of carbon that comes off as CO2 or as sheep is less kilos of carbon in the soil. So again, you've got a trade-off here between how much carbon you're going to get in order to get your profit or whatever else versus the amount you're putting down there. The other thing is that, again, because grasslands are generally not disturbed, well, it kind of depends on your stocking rate, etc., etc. So if you're managing them for reduced disturbance and diversity, especially botanical diversity, there will be an inherent capacity to sequester more carbon. So I can't give you specific answers because these always depend on the actual context, etc., etc. But if you pick up my general principles here and think about how you're managing your grassland in those terms, it's more likely that you're going to be able to sequester than actually start to lose.
If you're doing everything that you're saying and you're doing it quite well, but you recognise that you perhaps have got a specific problem and you go to one of these mycorrhizal sort of quick fixes, introducing them from outside, is there a danger that because you're not sure where these are coming from or how they've been created even, is there a danger that you're introducing disease or problems into your closed system? Is there a danger by bringing unknown things onto the farm?
Great question, thank you. How to keep it as a short answer. So basically, if your soil system genuinely does not have the microbes you need, and I would argue that in most cases that's not the case. Most of the time all soils have everything you need. It's just a matter of getting them expressed by managing the system appropriately. If they're genuinely absent, then introducing them is a start. However, there's a reason they're not there. So if you try to introduce them into a system that's not conducive to them being around, they're not going to prevail. So one of the consequences of the soil biodiversity is that it's very resistant to invasion. So if the concepts around introducing microbes to fix these things are rather ecologically naive in the sense that most of the time, 98% of what you put in there will be dead within 3 weeks because all these other organisms will be there, they're starving, they're just going to knock them out. And in my talk this afternoon, I'll give you some data examples of that. The danger of introducing something, therefore, that's something beneficial that you want to take over, it probably won't. Equally, something that's pathogenic that you don't is probably not going to get going on there. And again, I've got some data showing pathogen attenuation in relation to diversity of the system. But by and large, as I say, it's a bit like probiotics. You know, after I've had antibiotics, I do some probiotics for a while to get my system back into equilibrium, and then off we go again. But it's no good trying to force feed the system like this if it's not in the right state to receive it. So on the whole, it can do no harm, but it will cost, and the question then is, what's the cost benefit of this? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Do you know much about biochar? Is that a miracle for soil?
Well, as even Dante and Virgil would have written, there ain't no such thing as a miracle. So biochar is another option in the panoply of things that one can do to soil. It's a particular form of carbon that can have certain actions on certain components of the system. It's not a panacea. It's not a miracle. It affects different components. Part of the issue with biochar is such variable. Biochar is not one thing. It depends on where the char comes from and its preparation and so on and so forth. So it's not like, it's not like potassium nitrate or whatever else, or glyphosate for that matter. There's been a large meta-analysis done of the effects of biochar on production, like for the earthworms, and that meta-analysis, I don't know, it was a couple of years ago now, but the answer to that was, on balance, middling effect. So negative effects, positive effects, but no 25% increase on balance across the piece. The meta-analysis is saying kind of neutral. Therefore, might do some good, possibly do a bit of harm, but on the whole, probably won't make that much difference. My counter-argument to that would be unless you have an extremely compromised system. So a really blown up soil that's pretty much dead. So maybe, actually we're talking now in ecological restoration terms rather than just trying to chivvy up your barley field. Then it could start to have an impact and an effect. But I think there are much more effective ways of managing the soil system. Again, I'll talk about those this afternoon, but it comes back to these basic tenets on the screen now, but most particularly the use of plants to do all this.
Just one more.
Have you any observations on the dangers of introducing inadvertently microplastics into the soil?
Yeah, hot topic. So microplastics is the research biochar at the moment, so early days. There is, there was work with people getting concerned about nanoparticles, etc., and the impact of nanoparticles on the soil biota. So for microplastics, the jury's out. We don't have the evidence. And call me old-fashioned, but I like evidence for things around that. But hypotheses and common sense would suggest that, again, you're putting very persistent hydrocarbons into the system there. They can be degraded, but they take a long time and they require very specialist organisms. They may well mess up, especially the larger fauna. So my hypothesis would be that there may be impacts of microplastics on some of these larger multicellular organisms, nematodes up, perhaps earthworms and these sorts of things. But I personally am not aware of and can't point to good, robust data as yet. But common sense, hang on, this is a xenobiotic, and in the longer term, it's going to be more prevalent than glyphosate for sure.
Huge amount of information there. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to work Carl really hard over the next couple of days, so let's give him a bit of a break.
Thank you.